Imagine standing in a house you haven't entered in 7 years. A house you locked and walked away from because every room inside it was a reminder of something you could not survive remembering. The dust is thick on the furniture. The curtains are yellowed. The air smells like time that has been standing still. You are only there because a legal matter forced your hand, because if it were up to you, you would never have come back. You walk through the front door. You stand in the hallway. And then, you hear something. A sound from upstairs. A single creak of a floorboard. The slow, deliberate weight of a person shifting their position in a room directly above your head. And something in your body, something that bypasses thought entirely, goes completely still. Because that room above you is your dead son's bedroom. And your son has been dead for 7 years. You buried him. You cried at his grave. You spent 7 years learning to breathe around the hole his absence left in the center of your chest. You put one foot on the stairs. Then another. Your hand finds the banister. You climb. You reach the door. You open it. And standing at the window, with his back to you, is a boy. Thin. Overgrown hair. Clothes too large for his frame. And when he turns around and you see his face, you see your son's eyes looking back at you. The same dark brown eyes you have been staring at in a photograph on your nightstand for 7 years. And your entire understanding of your own life cracks straight down the middle. This is not a ghost story. This is not a dream. This is the story of Catherine Mercer, a self-made billionaire, one of the most powerful women in the country, who walked into her abandoned home on an ordinary Thursday afternoon and found something that should have been impossible. And before this video is over, you are going to understand exactly how it happened, who was responsible, and what the truth of those 7 years really looked like. Because nothing about this story is what it appeared to be on the surface. Not the death. Not the grief. Not the man Catherine trusted more than anyone in the world. Not a single thing. Stay with me. Because this story is going to change the way you think about the people sitting closest to you right now. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We genuinely love hearing from our viewers all over the world, and it means everything to us that you are here. And if you are new to this channel, please click the subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. We put everything into every single one of them. Now, let us begin. Catherine Mercer did not grow up with money. She did not grow up with stability. She did not grow up with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing, on a deep level, that someone is going to catch you if you fall. She grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of South Columbus, Ohio, in a building where the elevator was broken more often than it worked and where the hallway always smelled faintly of someone else's dinner. Her mother, Linda, worked the overnight shift at a laundromat on 5th Street 6 days a week, coming home just before Catherine left for school, still smelling of detergent and exhaustion, leaving a note on the kitchen counter most mornings because there was not enough time and not enough energy for a proper conversation before Catherine had to catch the bus. Her father, Gerald, was the kind of man who showed up in bursts, warm and full of promises in the good periods, absent and unreachable in the bad ones. By the time Catherine was 9 years old she had stopped tracking which period they were in. She had stopped expecting him at all. She was the kind of child that teachers remember. Not because she was the loudest or the most obviously gifted, but because of something quieter and harder to name, a self-possession, a focused attention, a way of sitting in a classroom that made it clear she was not just present but genuinely absorbing everything. She read everything she could get her hands on. She did her homework at the kitchen table every evening before her mother left for the night shift, working under the yellow glow of the overhead light with a glass of water and whatever she could find in the refrigerator for dinner. She taught herself basic algebra from a library book the summer before 7th grade because she had heard it was hard and she did not want to be caught off guard. That was Catherine. She did not wait for difficulty to arrive. She went looking for it in advance so she could be ready. When her mother got sick, genuinely sick, the kind of sick that turns a family's entire future on its head, Catherine was 15. It was a heart condition, serious enough to require medication and careful monitoring but not immediately life-threatening, though the specter of something worse was always present in the background of their apartment like a low-frequency hum that never fully went away. The medication was expensive. The hours at the laundromat had to be reduced. And Catherine, without being asked, without making a production of it, got a job at a copy shop 2 blocks from school on weekends and quietly started making sure the electricity bill got paid. She did not tell her mother where the money was coming from at first. She just left it in an envelope on the counter. Her mother figured it out eventually, of course. She sat Catherine down one evening and looked at her for a long moment without speaking, and then she said, "You should be 16, not 40. And Catherine said, "Someone has to be." Her mother cried. Catherine did not. She was already thinking about the next thing. She applied for every scholarship she could find during her senior year of high school. She got 3 of them, not the full ride she had hoped for, but enough, combined with part-time work, to make college possible. She chose Ohio State. She studied business with a minor in computer science, chose those 2 disciplines specifically because she had identified, with the clear-eyed practicality that defined everything she did, that the intersection of business and technology was where the next generation of wealth was going to be built. She was not wrong. She graduated in 3.5 years, 1 semester early, which she managed by taking overloaded course schedules every term, and walked across that stage with a degree, $4,000 in savings, and a specific, detailed idea for a company that she had been developing in a notebook she carried everywhere for the last 2 years of school. The idea was a logistics software platform, a system that would allow mid-size shipping and distribution companies to manage their supply chains with the same level of sophisticated integration that was previously only available to corporations large enough to build it themselves. It was 2003. The space was not empty, but it was not crowded in the way it would become later, and Catherine had identified a gap that the existing players had not bothered to fill because the market segment she was targeting was considered too small to be worth their attention. She considered it exactly the right size. She rented a 1-room office in downtown Columbus for $400 a month, bought a second-hand desk from an office liquidation sale, hired 2 people, a developer named Marcus and an operations coordinator named Jess, and started making calls. The first year was the kind of year that would have ended most people's stories before they began. She had 11 clients by December, which sounds like progress until you understand that those 11 clients were generating just enough revenue to cover payroll and the office rent with almost nothing left over, and that Catherine was paying herself nothing and living on pasta and black coffee and the specific, stubborn conviction that she was not going to stop. She worked 16-hour days. She slept on a cot she kept in the office 3 nights a week because the drive back to her apartment felt like time she could not afford. She called potential clients from a list she had built herself, cold calling without embarrassment or hesitation, because she believed in what she was selling and she had never been the kind of person who confused pride with refusing to ask for something she needed. By the end of year 2, she had 38 clients. By the end of year 3, she had hired 12 more people and moved into a larger office. She brought in a small amount of outside investment in year 4 from a regional venture firm whose managing partner later said that Catherine Mercer was the most prepared first-time founder he had ever sat across from, that she had walked into the pitch meeting with a 5-year financial model and a competitive analysis that most companies twice her size would not have been able to produce. By the time she was 32, Mercer Integrated Systems had annual revenues exceeding $40 million. By 35, it was over $200 million. By 38, the year that Noah disappeared, the year that everything changed, the company was valued at over $2 billion, and Catherine Mercer's name was appearing on lists and covers and in conversations that she had imagined from that copy shop job at 15 but had never quite allowed herself to believe would be real. She kept a small notebook with her at all times, a plain black composition book, nothing special about it from the outside, in which she recorded ideas, observations, competitive intelligence, and questions she had not yet found answers to. She filled one of those notebooks every 3 months, approximately, and she kept every one of them in a box under her desk, and sometimes, In the early days when the company was small and the outcome was genuinely uncertain, she would take one of the older ones out and read through it to remind herself that she had been moving in a direction this whole time, that every question she had written down and then eventually answered had pushed her further along a path she had chosen on purpose. That was important to her, the sense of deliberate motion. She had never wanted things to happen to her. She had always wanted to be the reason they happened. There is a particular kind of person who turns that quality into a career, and a rarer kind of person who turns it into something that changes an entire industry. Catherine was the rarer kind. The people who competed against her knew it. The people who worked for her knew it. Even the people who did not like her, and there were some, because a woman building an empire at that speed in that era collected detractors alongside admirers the way moving ships collect spray, even they knew it. She was the kind of person that the world eventually has to acknowledge on her own terms, because the alternative is simply inaccurate. She had a house in the hills outside Columbus, a large, beautiful property that she had purchased and renovated herself, choosing every tile and fixture and paint color personally, because after a lifetime of rented spaces and other people's choices, she wanted one place in the world that was entirely, unambiguously her own. She had built gardens in the back that she tended herself on Sunday mornings, which was the one non-negotiable hour in a week that was otherwise entirely consumed by work. She had a mural commissioned for her son's bedroom, a sky full of clouds and a hot air balloon, because Noah had become briefly and intensely obsessed with hot air balloons at age 4 after seeing one float over the highway on a family drive, pressing his face to the car window and saying, "Mom. Mom. Is that a flying house?" And she had a son. She had Noah. Noah James Mercer was born on a Tuesday in April, and Catherine would tell you, if you asked her, that the first moment she held him was the moment she understood, for the first time in her life, what it felt like to want to protect something more than she wanted to protect herself. She had spent her entire adult life being the one who held things together, the one who sacrificed, the one who pushed through, but that had always been driven by a kind of fierce, self-directed determination. It had never felt like love exactly. It had felt like necessity. Noah changed that. From the first morning she sat in that hospital room with him asleep on her chest, something in her reorganized permanently. He was not a responsibility. He was not a project. He was a person, her person, and the feeling she had for him was something she did not have a large enough word for. His father was not in the picture. That is a chapter of Catherine's life she has always kept short when she discusses it publicly, a relationship in her early 30s that was never serious enough to survive a pregnancy and that ended without drama but also without anything resembling partnership. He signed the paperwork, gave up parental rights, and was gone. Catherine raised Noah alone from the beginning, which suited her in ways she did not fully examine until much later. She was used to doing things alone. She was good at it. Noah was 2 years old when David Hale came into Catherine's professional life, and 3 when he became something more than professional. David had been recommended to Catherine by a mutual contact in the venture community, described as one of the sharpest financial minds in the Midwest, a man with a background in corporate restructuring and a reputation for being able to see inside a company's numbers the way other people see inside a room. He was 41 when they met. He was trim and composed, with the kind of even-tempered manner that registers as calm until you spend enough time around it to notice that it is not really calm, it is control. There is a difference. Calm is the absence of anxiety. Control is the management of it. Catherine would not recognize that distinction for a long time. He was good at his job. Genuinely good, that part was real and has never been disputed, not even by the people who came to despise him later. He had a precision with numbers that impressed even Catherine, who was no financial amateur herself. He identified inefficiencies in the company's cost structure within the first 3 months that saved Mercer Integrated Systems over $4 million annually. He restructured 2 underperforming divisions and turned them profitable within a year. He hired well, managed carefully, and never missed a detail. Catherine gave him more responsibility because he had earned it, and that was the logic she operated on: you earn what you get. He earned CFO within 18 months of joining the company. The personal relationship developed slowly and in the gaps between work, a dinner after a late evening in the office that stretched longer than either of them intended, a conversation that moved without warning from quarterly projections to something more honest and unguarded than either of them was in the habit of being. Catherine had not been in a relationship since Noah's father. She had told herself she did not have time, which was partly true. She had also told herself she did not particularly want one, which was less true than she admitted. David was steady and intelligent and present in a way that she found, after years of relying entirely on herself, unexpectedly comforting. She let her guard down. Slowly, carefully, with all the characteristic caution of a person who has been self-sufficient so long that vulnerability feels genuinely foreign. But she let it down. He moved into the house in the hills when Noah was 4. And for 2 years, for a period of time that Catherine has said she does not know how to evaluate now, whether it was real or whether it was always performance, it felt like a family. Noah called him David, not Dad, but the warmth between them was genuine on Noah's side, which is the side that mattered. David was patient with the child in the ways that matter most to a small boy. He got on the floor and built things. He remembered which dinosaur was Noah's current favorite. He showed up to the school fall festival when Catherine was traveling and sent her photos of Noah on the hayride with his face orange from a candy pumpkin. Catherine would see those photos on her phone in whatever hotel room she was in and feel simultaneously grateful and guilty and relieved, grateful that Noah was covered, guilty that she was not there, relieved that she could keep working without the worst version of her fear about her son being realized. She did not notice, at first, what was growing underneath the surface of that life. You rarely do. The things that will eventually hurt you most are almost never the things that announce themselves. They are the things that develop quietly, in the margins, while your attention is directed somewhere else. David Hale had begun diverting money from Mercer Integrated Systems approximately 14 months after he became CFO. The amounts were small at first, the kind of small that is designed specifically not to be noticed, routed through subsidiary accounts and vendor payments and a layering of financial transactions complex enough that even a careful audit would have needed to be specifically looking for it to find it. He was patient about it for the same reason he was patient about everything, because patience was not a virtue for David Hale so much as a strategy. He understood that the long game was always safer than the short one. What he was building, investigators later determined, was an exit. Not an immediate exit. He was not planning to disappear in the near term. What he was building was a reserve, a private financial foundation that existed entirely outside of his professional relationship with Catherine, that would give him the independence to move when the time was right. The question that investigators spent a great deal of time trying to answer was, what was he waiting for? What was the moment he was building toward? The answer, when it finally emerged through the investigation, was both calculated and deeply personal. David Hale had, at some point in the 3rd or 4th year of his relationship with Catherine, begun to understand that he was never going to own what he wanted to own. He had come to think of Mercer Integrated Systems as partly his, had allowed himself, in the private architecture of his own ambition, to believe that his contributions had made the company what it was, that his presence had been so central to its success that some meaningful portion of it belonged to him. And Catherine, who was meticulous about ownership structures and who had built her company with a clear and deliberate understanding of what she had built and who had built it, had never given him any grounds for that belief. His equity stake was modest. His role was significant but defined. He was, in the clearest legal and structural sense, an employee, a highly paid, highly trusted, deeply integrated employee, but an employee nonetheless. And at some point, that had become something he could not accept. The personal betrayal ran alongside the financial one and was, in some ways, harder to fully understand. People who knew David, colleagues, former associates, a therapist he had briefly seen years before who later spoke to investigators, described a man who had a profound and unexamined need to be the most important person in any room he occupied. Not the most celebrated. Not the most praised. The most essential. The person without whom nothing would function. And Catherine, who had built the company before he arrived and who would clearly continue to build it if he left, did not need him in the way his ego required her to. She valued him. She trusted him. She may even, in her way, have loved him. But she did not need him. And there is a particular kind of pride, fragile and dangerous, that cannot survive that distinction. The plan he ultimately executed had been forming, investigators believe, for approximately 2 years before he carried it out. It required outside help, people who would ask no questions in exchange for money, people with specific skills and no traceable connection to him. It required careful timing. It required that he understand Catherine's schedule, her patterns, her vulnerabilities. And it required that he be willing to use a 6-year-old child as a tool in a plan designed ultimately to serve his own financial interests. That is the part that no framing or context can soften. He looked at Noah, a child he had lived with, eaten breakfast beside, taken to school, helped with homework, and he decided that Noah was something that could be used. The night Noah disappeared, Catherine was in Seattle. She had been there for 4 days, a series of meetings with a potential West Coast logistics partner that had the potential to expand the company's footprint significantly, the kind of opportunity that required her physical presence and her full attention and that could not be delegated. She was good at being present when she was in a meeting. Whatever was happening at home, she had always been able to put it aside while she was working, to compartmentalize with the surgical efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime managing too many things simultaneously. But on the 4th night, sitting in a hotel restaurant across from 3 investors, she had been feeling a low, unspecific unease all evening that she could not trace to anything specific. A restlessness. The kind that makes you check your phone too often and lose the thread of a conversation and apologize for being distracted when you're not entirely sure what is distracting you. When her phone rang and she saw Rosa's name on the screen, she stood up before she had consciously decided to stand up. Rosa never called during a business dinner. Rosa was the most professionally calibrated person Catherine had ever employed. She understood schedules and priorities and the distinction between urgent and non-urgent with a precision that Catherine trusted completely. If Rosa was calling at 8:45 on a Thursday evening while Catherine was in a dinner meeting, something was wrong. She stepped away from the table and answered the call, and what she heard was not Rosa's usual careful, composed voice. It was a voice she had never heard from Rosa before, fractured, trying to hold itself together and not fully succeeding. David had picked Noah up from school at 3:15, which was part of the regular weekly routine. He was supposed to have Noah home by 6. It was now 8:45. Rosa had called David's cell phone 4 times. She had called the house line. She had driven past 2 of the parks David sometimes took Noah to on these afternoons. She had tried David's office. She had tried the number for David's brother in Cleveland that she had found in the household files. Nothing. No answer anywhere. Noah was not home. David was not reachable. And Rosa's voice, underneath all its effort to remain functional, was telling Catherine something that Catherine's body understood before her mind was willing to. She booked the first available flight back to Columbus, at 6:15 in the morning, which meant sitting in that hotel room for the rest of the night without sleeping, and called the Columbus police from her room at 9:30. The officer on duty logged the report and told her that given Noah's age and the circumstances, it would be taken seriously, that a detective would be in contact in the morning. She sat on the edge of the hotel bed with her phone in both hands and stared at the wall across from her and did something she almost never did. She let herself be frightened. Not frantic, Catherine did not do frantic, it was not in her wiring, but frightened in a deep, specific, very quiet way. The kind of frightened that does not move. That just sits. That waits. She called Rosa back and told her to stay at the house. She told her she would be home by 8 in the morning. She said, and she has remembered saying this, has thought about saying this many times in the years since, she said, he's going to be fine, Rosa. David has him. He's going to be fine. She did not sleep that night. She sat in the chair by the window and watched the lights of Seattle move and go still and move again, and she went over everything she knew about David Hale and tried to find in that knowledge a version of this situation that had a reasonable explanation. A misunderstanding. A spontaneous decision to take Noah somewhere for a night and a failure to communicate. An emergency of some kind that had consumed his attention. She found every version she could find and she held each one up to the light and examined it, and every one of them had something wrong with it, something that didn't hold, something that her honest intelligence refused to accept. By 4 a.m. she had stopped trying to find a reasonable explanation. By the time her cab pulled up to the airport at 5, she knew, not in the way you know a fact, but in the way you know something when your body and your mind and every instinct you have developed over a lifetime all arrive at the same place at the same time, she knew that something had been done to her. She did not know what yet. But she knew it had been done deliberately. And she knew it had been done by someone she trusted. She was right about both things. The investigation moved quickly at first, with the kind of urgency that attaches to a missing child case when the missing child's parent is a public figure. There were news cameras outside the house on the hill within 24 hours. Catherine's attorney held a brief press conference. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children was contacted. David Hale's photo was circulated to law enforcement databases nationally. His apartment, which he maintained separately, a detail Catherine had accepted without particular scrutiny, understanding it as a preference for personal space, was searched within 48 hours and found to be almost entirely cleared out. Not ransacked. Cleared. The closet empty, the drawers empty, the surfaces bare except for a few things that investigators concluded had been deliberately left behind to make the space look less deliberately abandoned than it was. His car was missing. His passport, investigators would later learn, had not been used at any border crossing, which told them either that he had not left the country or that he had used a different document to do so. The thing that is important to understand about the period that followed, the 3 weeks between Noah's disappearance and the discovery that changed everything, is what it cost Catherine to keep functioning during that time. She did it. She showed up. She answered every question from every detective and every investigator and every federal agent who came through her door. She reviewed security footage and financial records and contact lists. She gave interviews when her attorney advised her that public attention might generate leads. She kept the company running because 400 people depended on it and she was not going to compound one crisis with another. She functioned. But the woman who was functioning during those 3 weeks was running on something finer and more brittle than ordinary strength. She was running on the specific, necessary fiction that Noah was going to be found. That the next phone call was going to be the one. That the waiting had a limit. She had to believe that. The alternative was not survivable. The call that came 3 weeks later was not the one she was waiting for. A state trooper on a rural highway 30 miles east of Columbus had located a vehicle in a shallow gully off the road, a dark blue sedan registered under the name Raymond Curtis, an identity that investigators would subsequently determine was one of 2 false identities David Hale had been maintaining for at least 14 months prior to Noah's disappearance. The vehicle had been burned. The fire had been significant but not total, enough of the structure remained to allow investigation. Inside the vehicle, in the rear passenger area, investigators found physical remains. Small remains. The size and characteristics consistent with a child between the ages of 5 and 7. Catherine was told by a detective named Marcus Webb, who came to her office rather than her home because she had asked, when the investigation began, that any significant updates be delivered there. She had said, quietly, to Webb in their first meeting, "I work better when I'm somewhere I associate with thinking clearly." Webb sat across from her desk. He had a file folder that he placed on the desk but did not open. He told her what they had found. He told her what the initial analysis suggested. He told her that a more comprehensive forensic examination would take several weeks but that the preliminary indicators, combined with personal effects found at the scene, including a small sneaker of a size consistent with Noah's last known shoe size and a fragment of a fabric that Rosa had identified from a photograph as consistent with a jacket Noah had been wearing the day he disappeared, pointed in a direction that Webb was not going to soften because there was no kind way to deliver it. Catherine listened to all of it without speaking. When he finished, she asked 2 questions. The first was, "Are you certain?" He said not yet, not with full forensic certainty, but the evidence was substantial. The second question was, "Where is David Hale?" Webb said they did not know. That the vehicle had been registered to an identity that had no traceable living connections. That the investigation was ongoing. Catherine nodded. She thanked him. She waited until he left. Then she sat at her desk for a very long time, looking at nothing, and she did something she had not done in front of anyone since she was a teenager, sitting beside her mother's hospital bed. She wept. Completely. Without restraint. Without anyone watching. Alone in her office with the door closed, in the building she had built from $400 a month and 2 employees and a second-hand desk, Catherine Mercer fell apart. The forensic report, issued 6 weeks later, concluded that the remains were consistent with a child matching Noah Mercer's profile. DNA analysis was conducted, but the condition of the remains significantly limited its conclusiveness. The report noted a high degree of probability rather than absolute certainty, a qualification that was noted in the file and then effectively set aside because the weight of the other evidence was considered sufficient. Noah James Mercer was declared dead at age 6. David Hale was presumed dead. The case was formally closed 8 months later. Catherine buried an empty casket. There was not enough to bury in the traditional sense, and her attorney handled everything as gently as it could be handled, which was still not very gently, because there is no gentle version of burying a child. She wore a gray dress, not black, gray, because she said later that black felt too final and she was not yet ready for final, even though the paperwork said she had to be. A small number of people came. Her mother. Her sister. A handful of colleagues who had known Noah. Rosa, who stood at the back and barely held herself together. The pastor said words that Catherine heard but did not absorb. She placed a single yellow tulip on the casket. It had been Noah's favorite color, which he had told her once with complete seriousness. "Yellow is the happiest color, Mom. Don't you think?" She stood there and she thought about that. The happiest color. She put the tulip down. She watched the casket go into the ground. And then she went home and she did not come back to that house again for 7 years. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let us see who is truly following this story, because what comes next is the part that changes everything, and I want to know you are with me. 7 years is a long time. It is long enough to rebuild the surface of a life completely. Long enough that the sharp edges of grief dull into something more like a permanent ache, still present, always present, but no longer the kind of ache that stops you in the middle of a sentence or wakes you up gasping at 3 in the morning. Most of the time. Long enough that people who meet you after those 7 years have no idea what you are carrying, and you have gotten so practiced at not showing it that you sometimes forget yourself that it is there. Until something small and ordinary, the smell of a particular shampoo in a grocery store aisle, a child's laughter with a specific pitch, the color yellow, brings it back with a totality that makes you realize the ache never dulled at all. You just got better at working around it. Catherine sold the house in the hills 63 days after the funeral. She could not sleep in it. She had tried for those 63 days, and every night she would lie in her bed and hear the silence from the room down the hall, the room where Noah's unfinished mural was, the room where his toys were still organized on the shelf the way Rosa had kept them, and the silence was louder than any sound she had ever experienced. She put the house on the market, accepted the first reasonable offer, and moved into a clean, modern apartment downtown that had no history and no associations and no hallway that led to a child's bedroom. She kept one thing from Noah's room. The small wooden box with the clasp, the smooth stone, the folded drawing, the 3-legged plastic dinosaur. She put it in the center of her desk at work, where she could see it. She told no one what was in it. She ran the company. What else was she going to do? She ran it with the same focused, unhurried intensity that had always defined her, but there was a difference now that people who worked closely with her could feel without being able to fully articulate. Before Noah, Catherine's drive had been expansive, forward-looking, curious, genuinely excited about building. After, the drive was still there but it had changed its character. It had become more like maintenance than creation. She was keeping the thing running rather than imagining where it could go. She was doing the work because the work was what she had. She was not, if she is honest, doing it because she loved it anymore. She was doing it because stopping felt more dangerous than continuing. There were mornings in the first year when she would sit at her desk before anyone else arrived, before her assistant, before the early rising members of her leadership team, in the particular quiet of a large office building before it wakes up, and she would take the wooden box out of the center of her desk and hold it in both hands and just sit there. Not thinking, exactly. Not praying. She had never been a person who prayed in any traditional sense. Just sitting with the weight of it in her palms. The weight of the stone and the folded drawing and the three-legged dinosaur and everything they represented. It was the closest thing she had to a ritual. It was the closest thing she had to a way of acknowledging that the thing she was carrying was real, that she was not simply going to will it into being smaller than it was, that some mornings the only honest thing available to her was to hold it and know that it was there. And then she would put the box back. And she would turn on her computer. And she would do the work. And that was the structure of her days. She did not date. She did not pursue friendships with any particular intention. She had acquaintances, people in her professional world who respected her and occasionally had dinner with her and invited her to things she usually attended briefly and then left. She was not cold, exactly. She was present enough to be polite, engaged enough to be pleasant, professional enough to be effective. But she had, at some level below conscious decision, closed a door inside herself. The door behind which the part of her that connected to people in a fully open, fully present way had lived. She had closed it because that part of her was the part that had loved Noah, and the part that had trusted David, and keeping it closed felt like the only way to avoid a repeat of either loss. She understood this about herself. She did not try to fix it. She was not sure it was fixable. There was one night in the third year, she has never spoken about this publicly but has alluded to it in a way that leaves no room for misunderstanding, when she sat in her apartment at midnight and looked at her life from a distance and found it so empty, so stripped of the thing that had made it feel worth the building, that she understood for the first time in a visceral and undeniable way how people who are functioning on the outside can be disappearing on the inside. She was not in danger, she would say later. But she was close enough to the edge to understand how the edge had gotten where it was. She called her sister that night. Her sister picked up on the second ring. It was midnight, her sister had young children, she had clearly been asleep, and she did not say why she was calling, just said she needed to hear a voice. Her sister did not ask questions. She just talked. She talked about her kids, about her neighbor's ridiculous new lawnmower, about a show she had been watching that Catherine should try. She talked for 45 minutes and Catherine sat in the dark of her apartment and listened and said almost nothing. When they hung up, Catherine felt something that was not quite better but was enough to get through the night. She called her sister more after that. Not often enough, but more. Rosa called every year on Noah's birthday. She left a voicemail because Catherine never picked up, not out of unkindness, but because she had learned that the only way she could get through that particular day was by getting through it alone, with the box on her desk and a cup of tea and a strict internal agreement with herself that she was not going to fall apart. Rosa would leave a voicemail that was always brief, always the same in its essential content. I'm thinking about him today. I'm thinking about you. Take care of yourself, Catherine. Catherine listened to every single one of them. She kept them all saved in her voicemail folder, a digital archive of small, faithful acts of remembrance from a woman who had not been required to keep caring and had kept caring anyway. She never called back. She meant to, many times. She never did. The house in the hills had passed into a holding pattern that her attorney managed, a combination of the original sale falling through for reasons connected to the estate complications following the legal proceedings around David Hale's presumed death, and subsequent market fluctuations that made a second sale less straightforward than expected. Catherine paid no particular attention to it. It existed in a file on her attorney's desk. It had no reality for her beyond paperwork. She had locked the door and put the key away and she was finished with it, and the fact that finished and sold were not technically the same thing was a detail she had deliberately chosen not to engage with. For 6 years, the house sat empty. The neighbors occasionally reported something, a light, a sound, and these reports were fielded by a property management company Catherine's attorney had retained to handle basic maintenance, and they were logged as likely the result of the old electrical system or the wind and not pursued further. No one looked closely. No one had any reason to look closely. Until a boundary dispute with a neighboring property owner in the 7th year created a legal situation that required Catherine's personal involvement in a formal property assessment. Her attorney called her on a Monday morning. He explained the situation. He told her it would require approximately 2 hours of her time and her presence at the property to sign off on several assessments. He said he understood it was difficult and that he would make it as efficient as possible. Catherine said she would be there Thursday afternoon. She sat with that decision for the rest of Monday, and all of Tuesday, and most of Wednesday. She did not tell anyone she was going. She did not prepare for it emotionally, because she did not know how to prepare for it emotionally and she did not believe preparation would help. She thought, more than once during those 3 days, about calling her attorney and asking if there was any way to handle the assessment without her physical presence. She thought about it and she did not make that call, and she has said since that she does not know whether it was stubbornness or something else, something she cannot name, something that was pulling her back toward that house in a way that stubbornness alone does not explain. She just went. On Thursday afternoon, she got in her car and drove out of the city and up the hill and down the long gravel driveway, and she sat in her car for a moment and looked at the house she had not looked at in 7 years. The ivy had grown over part of the front wall. The garden she had planted and tended on Sunday mornings was completely wild now, the lines and beds she had laid out so carefully overtaken by whatever wanted to grow without guidance. One of the shutters on the 2nd floor was hanging at an angle that it had not been in before. It looked like a house in a painting, beautiful in the way that abandoned things can sometimes be beautiful, and sad in the specific way that beautiful abandoned things always are. Like something that deserved better than what had happened to it. She got out of the car. Her attorney and the property assessor were already inside, they had a key from the legal file and had arrived earlier to begin the preliminary walkthrough. She walked to the front door. It was open. She stepped into the hallway. The smell hit her first. Dust, and old wood, and something else, something underneath those things that she identified after a moment as warmth. Not the warmth of heating, the system had not been on, she would have known about that, but the ambient warmth of a space that has been regularly occupied by a living body. The subtle, unmistakable trace of presence. She noticed it and filed it away in some part of her mind and kept moving, because her attorney was calling her name from somewhere in the back of the house and she was focused on getting through the next 2 hours with the composure she had promised herself. She walked through the front hallway. The furniture she had left behind was still there, covered in white sheets, the shapes of the chairs and the side tables beneath them like patient ghosts. The staircase was directly ahead of her. The hallway branched left toward the kitchen. She turned left, toward her attorney's voice. She took 3 steps. And then she stopped. A single creak from the floor directly above her. Slow, deliberate, not the random settling of a structure, but the specific, weighted sound of a person shifting their position. One foot redistributing to account for another. Catherine had lived in this house for 9 years before she left it. She knew every sound it made. She knew the difference between the house talking to itself and the house responding to something in it. This was the second thing. She turned and looked at the ceiling above her. The room above was Noah's bedroom. She stood completely still. Her attorney was still talking in the kitchen, unaware. And then she heard it again, a footstep. Careful. Then another. Moving slowly toward the window side of the room. She did not call out. She has been asked many times since why she did not call out, why she did not say something, make a sound, alert her attorney. She has never been fully able to answer that question in a way that satisfies people who want a logical answer, because the honest answer is not logical. The honest answer is that some part of her body already knew something that her mind was not yet ready to process, and that part of her had made the decision before the rest of her caught up. Her hand found the banister. Her foot found the first stair. She began to climb. The stairs were quiet under her weight. She moved slowly, placing each foot with care, though she could not have said in the moment whether she was trying not to startle whoever was up there or trying not to break whatever fragile thing she felt forming in the air around her. She reached the landing. She turned toward the door at the end of the hall. The door to the room with the clouds on the wall and the half-finished hot air balloon and the shelf where Noah's toys had sat in a row arranged by size because Rosa had organized them that way every single time she tidied up. The footsteps inside had gone still. Whoever was in that room had heard her coming and had stopped moving. She walked to the door. She put her hand on the handle. She pushed it open. He was standing at the window with his back to her. 13 years old. Thin in the way that a child is thin when their nutrition has been managed by circumstances rather than care, not ill, but spare, the kind of thin that speaks of missed meals and sporadic plenty and a body that has learned to do without. His hair was too long, curling at the nape of his neck, the kind of length that happens when no one is cutting it on a schedule. His clothes were too large, a dark green sweatshirt that hung off his shoulders, jeans that were cinched at the waist with a belt that had been punched with an extra hole. He was standing very still, with the posture of someone who has heard something approaching and is deciding what to do about it. His right hand was resting against the window frame. His head was slightly bowed. Catherine stood in the doorway and she looked at the back of this boy and she felt something move through her body that she has spent years trying to describe accurately and has never fully managed. She said once that it was as if every internal clock she possessed stopped simultaneously, not the stopping of death but the stopping of suspension, of a single held breath extended beyond what breathing allows. She said it was not recognition in the ordinary sense. She said it was recognition in a sense that was older and deeper than ordinary, the kind that does not require a face, that does not require a voice, that lives in a register below all of those. Her body knew. Before her mind could catch up, before her eyes had seen anything beyond the back of a thin boy in an oversized sweatshirt standing at the window of what had been her dead son's bedroom, her body knew. He turned around. He had dark eyes. Wide set, slightly tilted at the outer corners in the way that had always made him look, even as a very small child, as though he were on the verge of understanding something important. There was a small scar on his chin, from a fall in the kitchen when he was 4 years old, running in his socks on the tile, catching the edge of the counter on the way down. Catherine had pressed a folded cloth to that cut for 20 minutes while he cried, and she had told him he was brave, so brave, and he had said through his tears, "Am I brave like you, Mom?" She had kept that moment in her chest for 7 years without knowing she was keeping it. The scar was still there. It was still his chin. It was still his eyes. He was taller and older and the softness of childhood had started to give way to the angles of adolescence, but underneath every change, underneath every year of growing that she had not witnessed, he was Noah. He was her son. He was standing in front of her and he was alive. His expression when he turned was guarded. That was the first thing, that guardedness, that careful, trained assessment of a new thing in his environment, the look of a child who has been in enough uncertain situations that every new situation is approached with the question, is this safe? It was an expression no 6-year-old had worn. It was an expression that 7 years had put there. She saw it, and even through everything else she was feeling in that moment, she felt the specific sorrow of seeing it on his face. On his face that she knew. On the face of her son. She said his name. Just that. Just Noah. It came out barely above a whisper, not because she was trying to be quiet but because her voice, which had served her flawlessly in boardrooms and courtrooms and press conferences for 20 years, had reduced itself to almost nothing at the threshold of that room. He looked at her. The guardedness held for a moment, a long moment, several seconds, long enough that she was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she normally was not. And then it broke. Not slowly. All at once, the way a surface breaks rather than bends. His face opened up entirely and for just a second, for just 1 second before anything else, he looked exactly the way he had looked at 4 years old, watching a hot air balloon float over the highway from the back window of her car. Like someone seeing something they could not quite believe was real. And then he said, quietly, in a voice that had dropped with age but still had something in it that she would have recognized in any room in the world, he said, "Mom. I didn't think you'd ever come back here." She crossed the room. She did not think about it. She just moved. And she held her son for the first time in 7 years, and neither of them said anything for a long moment, and she felt him shaking, or felt herself shaking, she was never sure afterward which one it was, and she pressed her hand to the back of his head the way she had always done when he was small and scared, and she said, "I'm here. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." And he gripped the back of her jacket with both hands the way a very small child grips, with all their strength, the thing they are most afraid of losing. And they stayed like that. For a long time. They just stayed like that. He pulled back eventually and looked at her with those eyes, and he said, "He told me you were dead. He said you died in an accident when I was little. He showed me, he had things that looked like proof." I believed him for a long time. His voice was steady but barely. And then I stopped believing him. But by then I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to find you. I came back here because it was the only place I knew was yours. I thought maybe, I don't know what I thought. I just kept coming back here. Catherine looked at her son, her 13-year-old son who had spent 7 years surviving on the strength of a memory and the hope that a place connected to his mother might eventually deliver her back to him, and she said, "I never stopped looking. Not for a single day. I want you to know that. Whatever you were told, I never stopped. Think about what it means to keep coming back to an abandoned house because it is the only piece of the person you love that you still have access to. Think about a child making that choice, not once, but over and over again, across years, with no guarantee that anyone would ever come. What does that tell you about what a mother means to her child? About the kind of love that survives being told it has nowhere left to go? Leave me your thoughts in the comments. I want to know what this moment does to you. The investigation that followed Catherine's discovery was extensive and moved with a speed that the original investigation had never had, because now there was a living child who could speak, and a trail that had been warming in place for 7 years waiting to be followed. The first priority was Noah's immediate safety and well-being. He was taken to a hospital for evaluation within hours of being found, and a forensic interview specialist began the careful, methodical work of documenting his account in a way that was both legally useful and minimally re-traumatizing. He was cooperative from the beginning. He had been waiting a long time to tell someone the truth. What emerged from those interviews, combined with the financial investigation that was reopened in parallel, was a picture of David Hale's plan that was more intricate and more coldly deliberate than even Catherine's darkest assumptions during those 7 years had allowed her to imagine. The financial theft had begun, as investigators eventually determined, in month 14 of his time as CFO, modest amounts, carefully layered, building over 4 years into a reserve of approximately $11 million held across a network of accounts and shell entities that had taken investigators 2 full years of subsequent work to untangle completely. But the money, as significant as it was not the whole story. The money was the infrastructure. The plan had a different center. David Hale had concluded, at some point in the 4th or 5th year of his relationship with Catherine, that the most direct path to the kind of control he wanted, over the company, over the assets, over the trajectory of his own financial future, ran through Catherine's emotional state rather than through any legal or financial maneuver. Catherine Mercer functioning at full capacity was almost impossible to outmaneuver. She was too sharp, too meticulous, too unlikely to miss something important. But Catherine Mercer broken, Catherine Mercer consumed by grief, by trauma, by the kind of devastation that reorganizes a person's entire internal architecture, was a different equation. A grieving Catherine might make decisions she would not otherwise make. Might sign things she would not otherwise sign. Might cede control she would not otherwise cede. Might, in the fog of loss, fail to notice what was being moved and where. He had not counted on Catherine's grief making her retreat into the company rather than away from it. He had not anticipated that loss, for a woman who had always processed difficulty by working harder, would produce the opposite of the vulnerability he was engineering for. In that sense, his plan failed its primary strategic objective. But the collateral damage, the 7 years of a mother believing her child was dead, the 7 years of a child being hidden and lied to, the specific, profound cruelty of what was done to both of them, that damage was total regardless of whether the plan achieved its financial goals. Noah had been moved through several locations during the first 2 years. The people involved, individuals in David's network who were paid and told varying cover stories, did not, for the most part, understand the full scope of what they were participating in. Some believed they were helping with a private family custody arrangement gone wrong. Some asked no questions in exchange for the money. Noah was not mistreated in the direct physical sense during this period, but he was moved, and isolated, and told things about his mother that were systematically, deliberately false, that she had died, that she had not wanted him, that she had signed documents giving David permanent custody. He was 6 years old when those lies were first told to him. He did not have the context or the resources to disbelieve them. David had arranged for a woman to serve as a caretaker during this period, a woman who went by the name Sandra, whose real identity investigators took several months to establish, and who had a complicated and not entirely clear relationship with David that predated his time at Mercer Integrated Systems. Sandra cared for Noah with a functional adequacy. He was fed, clothed, enrolled in a small private homeschool cooperative that kept him off public school databases, given a false name for external use. She was not warm in the way Rosa had been warm. She was not cruel. She was professional in the way that people are professional when they are being paid to do something they understand to be ethically compromised, competently, at a distance, without attachment. But David's resources and attention shifted over time. The financial architecture he was maintaining required his focus. His own false identity required management. And as the years passed and the original plan's strategic objective remained unachieved, the operation around Noah became less a priority and more a liability, something he was maintaining out of the inertia of having started it rather than because it was still serving its original purpose. Sandra departed at some point in year 4, investigators were never entirely precise about the timing, and the arrangement that replaced her was thinner and less reliable. Noah, by then 9 years old, was beginning to understand that the world he was living in was not a legitimate one. He could not have named it in those terms, but he could feel it. He had always been, like his mother, the kind of person who noticed things. It was Rosa who saved his life. Not dramatically, not in a single moment, but in the sustained and faithful way that real saving almost always happens, quietly, over time, at personal cost, without anyone watching. Rosa had never believed the official story. She had said so, to the original investigators, and had been heard politely and disregarded as a grieving former employee in denial about an outcome that was painful to accept. She had continued to believe it because she knew David Hale in the specific way that domestic staff know the people they work for, not through the curated version people present to colleagues and professional contacts, but through the unguarded moments, the small behaviors, the texture of daily life that is visible only to the people who are quietly present for it. And what Rosa knew about David Hale told her that the man was capable of exactly this. She had been contacted, in year 3, through an intermediary she was never able to fully identify, a message delivered through a channel she understood to be connected to Noah without being able to prove it. She had responded. And what followed was a 3-year arrangement that required her to maintain absolute silence about what she knew while providing, through carefully routed means, the food and money and clothing that kept Noah alive and relatively stable through the years when the official arrangement around him had thinned to almost nothing. She had been frightened. David had made threats in the early period, indirect, untraceable, but clear enough in their meaning, and she had taken them seriously. She had not gone to the police because she had genuinely believed, based on what she had been told, that doing so would put Noah at risk in a way that her quiet support would not. Was it the right decision? Catherine has been asked that question and has consistently refused to answer it in a simple way. She has said that Rosa made the decision she made with the information she had and the fear she had, and that Rosa kept her son alive, and that those two facts are what she chooses to hold. She does not revisit the question of what might have been different. It is not a productive question. Noah is here. That is what is true. David Hale was located in Brentwood, Tennessee, a suburb of Nashville, on a Wednesday morning in November, 4 weeks after Catherine found Noah in the house on the hill. He was living as a man named Gerald Shaw, running a small private equity advisory firm that investigators determined was managing, among other things, portions of the money he had taken from Mercer Integrated Systems. He was arrested at his home by federal agents at 6:15 in the morning. A neighbor who witnessed the arrest from a driveway across the street said later that what she remembered most was how unsurprised he seemed. Not calm, exactly. More like, finished. Like a man who had been running for a long time and had known, somewhere underneath the running, that this was always where it ended. He was extradited to Ohio. He faced charges that included kidnapping, aggravated criminal conspiracy, financial fraud across multiple counts, evidence tampering, and additional charges related to the staging of the accident scene, which investigators determined had involved the use of human remains obtained through means that resulted in separate criminal charges of a severity that added substantially to his sentence. His defense team mounted a case centered on the argument that his actions with regard to Noah had been motivated by a genuine belief that Noah was better off in his care than in the care of a mother who was, as his attorney put it, more invested in her balance sheet than in her child. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 40 minutes. They returned a guilty verdict on all counts. The judge sentenced David Hale to 34 years in federal prison and did not recommend parole consideration before the 25th year. He was 54 years old at sentencing. The math is not favorable to him. Catherine issued a single public statement on the day of the conviction. It was 4 sentences. It thanked the investigators and prosecutors. It acknowledged Rosa by name. It said that Noah was healing and that the family's privacy during that process was what they needed most. And it said, in the final sentence, and this was the sentence that was quoted everywhere, that spread across every news summary of the case, that people who had no personal connection to the story remembered for years afterward. It said, "No amount of power or money or ambition is worth the cost of what was taken from my son. I know that now. I want to make sure I never forget it." The reunification of Catherine and Noah was not a single moment. It was a process, and it was hard, and anyone who tells you that love solves the damage that 7 years of isolation and systematic deception does to a child has never been in a room with that child and tried to be patient when every instinct is screaming at you to fix it faster. Noah was 13. He had survived. He was intelligent and perceptive and, underneath everything that had been layered over him, still recognizably himself in the ways that mattered most. But he was also a boy who had been told his mother was dead, who had been moved from place to place and lied to by adults he depended on, who had learned to be careful with his trust because giving it to the wrong person had costs he could not afford. He was guarded. He was watchful. He was sometimes, in the first weeks, very far away even when he was sitting in the same room as Catherine, present in body, somewhere else in a part of his mind that had learned to retreat when things got difficult. Catherine recognized that behavior. She had the same behavior. She came by it the same way he had, through a childhood that required you to develop it for survival. Seeing it in him was like looking at something true about herself that she had never let herself look at directly. She worked with a team of therapists, one for Noah, one for herself, and one who saw them together. The family therapist was a woman named Dr. Patricia Hollins, who had spent 20 years working with children and families recovering from abduction and prolonged separation, and who had a way of sitting with the hardest things in a room without either minimizing them or catastrophizing them that both Catherine and Noah, independently, described as the thing that made it possible to keep coming back each week. Catherine has said that therapy during that period was the hardest thing she has ever done. Harder than building the company. Harder than the grief years. Because in therapy there was nowhere to retreat to and nothing to manage. There was just the truth of what had happened, and the truth of who she had been before it, and the work of figuring out what she wanted to be going forward. It required her to look at the ways she had been absent even before David took Noah. The 40 weeks of travel. The late nights. The drawings on the kitchen counter that she had not been there to see being made. That part of the reckoning was not about David. That part was about her. And she did not look away from it. Noah, for his part, healed in the non-linear, unpredictable way that real healing happens. There were weeks that were good, weeks where he laughed freely, where he came to find her in the evenings without a specific reason, where he sat at the kitchen counter and talked about whatever was in his head the way teenagers talk when they feel safe. And there were weeks that were not good. Weeks when he was withdrawn and short-tempered and came home from school and went straight to his room and closed the door and did not come out until dinner, and Catherine would stand in the hallway outside that closed door and remind herself of what Dr. Hollins had told her: you cannot rush a growing thing. You can only make sure the conditions are right and trust that it knows how to grow. She put her hand on the door sometimes and then took it away. She made dinner. She knocked at dinner time. He came out. They ate. That was enough. For that day, that was enough. There were harder conversations, too, conversations that Catherine has said were among the most difficult of her life, more difficult in some ways than the grief years, because grief at least has a kind of terrible simplicity to it. These conversations were not simple. Noah asked her once, about 5 months in, why she had worked so much when he was little. Not accusingly, he was past accusation by then, or was working past it with Dr. Hollins's help, but with a genuine, searching honesty that deserved the same in return. And Catherine sat with that question for a long moment before she answered it, because she was not going to give him a practiced answer, she was not going to give him the version she had given in interviews. She told him the truth. She told him about being 15 and covering the electricity bill and deciding somewhere in the process of surviving that work and money and self-sufficiency were the same thing as being safe, and that she had never really questioned that equation until it had cost her something she could not get back. She told him she was sorry that the cost had included him. He listened to all of it without interrupting. And then he said, "I get it. I think I do the same thing, kind of. Like, I focus on stuff so I don't have to feel stuff." And she looked at her 13-year-old son who had been through things most adults will never experience, and she thought, there you are. There is the person I made. And she said, yeah. Me too. We can both work on that. He said, okay. And that was that. That was one of the best conversations she has ever had. He moved fully back in with her 10 months after the Thursday afternoon in October when she had climbed those stairs and opened that door. The house she bought for them was new to both of them, she had chosen it specifically for that reason, so that they were starting somewhere that belonged to neither of them yet, somewhere they were building together rather than her returning to something she already owned and him being placed inside it. He stood in the doorway of his bedroom on the first day and looked at it for a long time. She had not decorated it, had left it deliberately bare so he could make it his own, and then he turned around and said, "Can I paint the walls?" She said absolutely. He said, "I want dark blue. Like the night sky." She said that was a great choice. She meant it. She meant it completely. That first morning when she came downstairs and found him at the kitchen counter, slightly hunched, elbows on the surface, watching her move around the kitchen with that particular expression of relaxed attention that had been his since he was 3 years old, she felt something unlock in her chest that she had not fully realized was locked. Not the grief unlocking. Not the 7 years unlocking. Something older than that. Something that had been locked since she was 15 years old and covering the electricity bill alone and telling herself that needing people was a weakness she could not afford. She looked at her son sitting at her kitchen counter comfortable enough to be bored and she thought, this is what I was always building toward. This ordinary morning. This. Everything else was just the road to get here. Rosa came back. Catherine called her 3 months after the reunion, called her directly this time, no voicemail, just Rosa picking up on the second ring and not saying anything for a moment when she heard Catherine's voice, just a silence that contained 7 years of keeping faith without anyone watching. Catherine asked if she would come back. Rosa said she would need to think about it. She called back 2 days later and said yes. She manages Catherine's household now with the same quiet, unshowable competence she always had, and her relationship with Noah is its own particular thing, built in the dark and in hiding and in the specific kind of love that shows up and stays not because it is required to but because it simply cannot do otherwise. Noah calls her his second mom. He has always called her that. The first time he said it in front of Catherine, Catherine looked at Rosa and Rosa looked at Catherine and neither of them said anything, and that silence was one of the most complete things Catherine has ever been part of. The company went through changes. Catherine kept ownership, kept oversight, but she restructured her role with an intentionality and a permanence that she had been promising herself for years without following through on. She promoted 2 executives who had been with her for more than a decade into expanded roles that gave them genuine authority rather than the kind of delegated authority that always runs through a single person at the top. She removed herself from the day-to-day. She reduced her travel to 8 weeks a year, maximum. She took Fridays off, not always entirely, not always without checking in, but off enough to matter. She restarted the Sunday morning garden hours, this time in a new garden at the new house that she and Noah built together from scratch, choosing plants on a Saturday afternoon at a nursery where he vetoed 3 of her choices and she vetoed 2 of his, and they compromised on a climbing rose that they were both convinced the other one had eventually agreed to enthusiastically. The climbing rose is doing well, as it happens. It has been 2 full seasons in the ground and it is moving up the trellis the way a well-planted thing does, slowly, with intention, reaching for what it needs without being rushed. The house in the hills, the abandoned house, the house where it all happened, the house with the stairs and the window and the room at the top, Catherine did not sell it. She has thought about selling it many times and she has not done it. She has had it properly cared for, the ivy managed, the shutter replaced, the garden cleared back to something intentional. She went back once, a year after that October Thursday, and she stood in the room with the clouds on the wall and the half-finished hot air balloon, and she looked at the unfinished mural for a long time. The painter who had originally commissioned it, a man named Thomas Reedy who had been doing residential murals in Columbus for 30 years, was still working, still taking commissions. She called him. He remembered the project immediately, remembered the room, remembered the brief he had been given when Noah was 4 years old and desperately in love with the idea of a flying house. She asked if he would come back. He said he would come back the following week if she needed him to. She told him what she wanted in the balloon basket, 2 figures, a woman and a boy, looking outward. He came. He spent 2 days finishing what he had started 9 years before. When he was done he called Catherine in from the hallway, and she stood in the doorway of the room and looked at it, the completed sky, the full balloon, the woman and the boy in the basket looking out at something beyond the frame, something the viewer cannot see, something they are both clearly moving toward. Thomas Reedy said, when he was done, that it was the most personal work he had ever finished. That he could feel something in it that he did not have a word for. Catherine stood there for a long time. Then she took a photo and sent it to Noah, who was at home in the new house, and his text back came within 30 seconds. 3 words. That's really us. It is really them. That is the truest thing about this story. After everything, after the ambition and the grief and the betrayal and the 7 years of a lie that cost them both more than either of them will ever be fully able to account for, it is still really them. A woman and a boy. A mother and her son. Looking out at something they are moving toward together. Not knowing exactly what it is. Going toward it anyway. I want to ask you to stay with me for just a few more minutes, because I think there is something in this story that goes beyond the story itself. Something that belongs to you as much as it belongs to Catherine and Noah. We live in a world that is extraordinarily good at making us feel that the things that matter most, the people we love, the moments we are present for, the ordinary Tuesday evenings and the homework at the kitchen table and the bedtime conversations that seem routine until they suddenly are not, can be deferred. Can wait. Will still be there after the next meeting, the next deadline, the next level of success that we tell ourselves will finally feel like enough to justify slowing down. The world tells us this constantly, in 1,000 different ways, and we believe it because we need to believe it, because if we admit it, fully and honestly, how much we are trading away in the daily choices we make, we would have to make different choices. And different choices are frightening. They require us to reorder what we have told ourselves our lives are about. Catherine Mercer built one of the most successful companies in the country by the time she was 38 years old. She started with nothing. She earned everything she had. And she would give every dollar of it, every valuation, every cover story, every contract in all 22 states, to have back the years she was not there. Not the 7 years that David Hale stole. The years before that. The dinners she missed. The drawings she came home too late to be shown. The ordinary days she was not present for because she was building something she told herself was for him, when the truth she sat with in therapy for years and has been honest about in public, is that it was for her. It was for the 15-year-old girl who had covered the electricity bill alone and decided that security meant money and money meant she would never be that vulnerable again. She was building for that girl. And in doing it, she had been absent for her son in ways that mattered. That is not about David Hale. That part is entirely hers. She does not tell this story to punish herself. She tells it, and she has told it, in interviews and in conversations with other parents and in a foundation she has established that works with families affected by parental abduction, because she believes the truth of it is useful. She believes that most of us are doing some version of the same thing, at whatever scale our own lives operate at. That most of us have someone we are deferring presence with. Someone who will understand. Someone who will wait. And she wants people to hear her story and ask themselves, honestly, without defensiveness, whether the thing they are building is for the people they say it is for, or whether it is for something older and more private inside themselves. That is not a question with a comfortable answer. But it is the right question. If this story has reached you in any way, if anything in it has made you think about your own life, your own choices, your own person who needs more of you than they are currently getting, then tell me that in the comments. Tell me what you are going to do differently. Tell me who you are going to call. Because the most powerful thing that stories like this one can do is not make you feel something and then let that feeling go when you close the app and go back to your life. The most powerful thing a story can do is stay with you. Carry you somewhere you needed to go. Be the thing that tips the balance on a decision you have been sitting on too long. Think about what this story actually asks of you. Not much, really. It asks you to look honestly at the gap between where you are and where you want to be in the lives of the people you love. It asks you to consider whether the things consuming most of your energy are truly the most important things, or whether they are the most urgent things, because urgent and important are not the same, and most of us spend the majority of our lives serving the urgent at the direct expense of the important. Catherine Mercer would be the first person to tell you that. She built a $2 billion company and she would trade the valuation in a moment, in less than a moment, without hesitation, for one ordinary evening she missed. One dinner. One drawing she was not there to be shown. One bedtime story she was too tired to read all the way through. The arithmetic of that trade is not complicated. It is just very difficult to see clearly when you are inside the building years and convinced that what you are building justifies the cost. And I think most people watching this video are in some version of those building years. Maybe not building a company. Building a career. Building financial security. Building a reputation. Building a future for the people you love, genuinely, without cynicism, because the desire to give your children and your family a better life than the one you had is a real and honorable thing, and dismissing it as mere ambition misses something important about why people work as hard as they do. But even the most honorable motivation can become the thing that costs you everything you were working for, if you let it run without examination. That is the truth that Catherine earned the hard way. And she is sharing it so that you do not have to earn it the same way. The question she asks people now, when she speaks at events or sits down for interviews, is simple and specific and uncomfortable in the way that simple specific questions always are. She asks, when was the last time you were fully present with the person you love most? Not in the same room. Not checking your phone less than usual. Fully present, undivided, unhurried, genuinely there. If the answer comes quickly and easily, you are ahead of where most people are. If the answer takes a while, or if you realize that you cannot actually remember the last time, this story is for you. And today is a better day than tomorrow to do something about it. If this story did that for you, share it. Send it to someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes the most important thing we can do for the people we love is put the right story in front of them at the right moment. And that costs nothing. And it might mean everything. I want to stay with Noah for a moment longer, because I think his side of this story deserves more than what it usually gets when people tell it. When this story is discussed, in the press, in the advocacy community, in the conversations that followed the trial, the focus is almost always on Catherine. On her grief, her discovery, her reunion, her transformation. And all of that is real and all of it matters. But Noah was not a supporting character in his own story. He was a child who went through something that no child should go through, and he came out of it with a specific kind of knowledge about the world that most people never have to acquire, and the way he carried that knowledge, and eventually put it down, as much as a person ever put something like that down, is worth understanding. He was 6 years old when David took him. 6. At 6 years old, the world is still largely a place of trust. You trust the adults around you because that is what children are wired to do, because they have to be, because they cannot survive without that trust, because evolution built it into them as a survival mechanism and it works most of the time, and when it doesn't work the damage is enormous. Noah trusted David. Not with the particular, tested trust of someone who has chosen to be vulnerable. He was 6, he did not have the framework for that kind of deliberate choice. He trusted him the way a child trusts a familiar adult. Automatically. Without thinking about it. The way you trust that the floor will hold when you take a step. And then one afternoon, on a drive that started the way every other drive had started, David told him a story about his mother. That she had been in an accident. That she was gone. That he, David, was going to take care of him now. He said it in the calm, measured tone that he used for everything, the tone that had fooled Catherine for years, that had fooled an entire company of 400 people for years. A 6-year-old child had no more chance of seeing through it than anyone else had. Noah believed him for approximately 2 years. He has said this in interviews, carefully, with the kind of precision that suggests he has thought about the timeline a great deal. He believed it because the evidence supported it. David produced documents, photographs, a story that held together well enough for a child with no access to information that might contradict it. He grieved his mother the way a child grieves, not in the sustained, articulated way that adults grieve, but in flashes. In the middle of a meal. Before sleep. When he saw something that reminded him of her. He did not have anyone to grieve with, which is its own particular cruelty. He had Sandra, who was functionally adequate and emotionally absent. He had whatever version of David showed up on any given week, which became less and less frequent as the years passed and David's attention was consumed by his own survival. And he had himself. A 6-year-old boy, then a 7-year-old boy, processing the loss of his mother entirely alone, in a sequence of rooms he had not chosen, in a life that had been constructed for him out of materials that were not real. He started to disbelieve the story somewhere around age 8. He could not have told you exactly what changed. It was not a single thing, he has said, but an accumulation. Small inconsistencies in what David had told him over the years. The way David deflected certain questions. The fact that when he asked to see where his mother was buried, the answer was always a version of not now, later, when things settled down, a deferral that never resolved into an actual answer. He was 8 years old and he was doing what his mother did at 8 years old, noticing things, filing them away, building a picture out of observed details because no one was going to give him a complete one. He was his mother's child in the deepest possible sense. He had her instincts, her self-reliance, her refusal to simply accept a version of events that did not fully add up. And the version of events he had been given did not fully add up. By 9, he was certain that something was wrong with the story. He was not certain what the truth was. He did not allow himself to hope for what the truth might be, because hoping and being wrong felt like a cost he could not afford, but he was certain the story he had been told was not the whole truth. He began, in the careful, private way of a child who has learned that the world does not always reward transparency, to look for evidence. He searched through the limited materials available to him. He found, in a folder David had not secured carefully enough, a printout of a news article, old, several years old, from the Columbus Dispatch, that mentioned Catherine Mercer's company and, briefly, her missing son. He read it 3 times. He put it back exactly where he found it. He did not tell anyone what he had found. He sat with it for weeks, alone, turning it over and over in his mind, and what he felt, he has described this in detail and it is worth repeating exactly, was not immediate joy or relief. It was something more complicated. It was grief again, but a different kind. Because if his mother was not dead, then he had spent 3 years mourning someone who was alive, and he had spent 3 years being kept from someone who might have been looking for him, and the loss of those 3 years was real even if the death was not. He cried about that. Alone, in the room he was in at the time, in the house that was not his. He cried for those 3 years. And then he made a decision. He was going to find his way back to her house. Not immediately. Not recklessly. He was 9 years old and he had no money and no documentation and no one he could trust with what he knew. But he had a destination. He had the address of the house in the hills outside Columbus that he had lived in from the time he was a baby until he was 6. He remembered it the way children remember the places where they felt safest, with a specificity that is almost physical. A memory of the smell of the kitchen and the feeling of the carpet on the upstairs landing and the view from his bedroom window of the garden where his mother worked on Sunday mornings. He had held that address in his memory the way you hold something precious and fragile, carefully, consistently, making sure it was still there every time he checked. And he was going back to it. He did not know when. He did not know how. But he was going back. It took him 4 years. 4 more years of maneuvering, of building the small freedoms and the partial independences and the trusted intermediaries, Rosa among them, eventually, that made it possible for him to be where he was on that October Thursday afternoon. Standing at the window of his old bedroom. Waiting. He did not know Catherine was coming that day specifically. He came back to the house as often as he could manage it. It had become a kind of ritual, a tether, the one place in the world that felt connected to the person he was looking for. He came back and he sat in that room and he looked out that window and he waited in the way that children wait when they have no other option, which is with a patience that adults find difficult to comprehend, and that is, in its own way, one of the most heartbreaking things about childhood. He was patient. For 4 years, across circumstances no child should have had to navigate, he was patient. And on a Thursday afternoon in October, a car came down the long gravel driveway. And a woman got out. And even from the window, even at a distance, even after 7 years, he knew her. He stood at the window and he watched her walk to the front door and he did not move. He did not run. He stood very still and he waited, and he heard her come in, and he heard her take steps toward the back of the house, and then he heard her stop. And then he heard her coming up the stairs. And something in him, something he has described as the only moment in 4 years when he completely forgot to be careful, decided, without consulting the cautious and self-protective part of him that had kept him alive, to simply turn around. To just turn around and let whatever happened next, happen. He has said that he was not afraid in that moment. He has said that is the thing that surprised him most, that he had been afraid of so many things for so many years, and in that specific moment, standing in his old bedroom, hearing his mother's footsteps on the other side of the door, he was not afraid at all. He was just ready. He had been ready for 4 years. The door opened. And there she was. In the 3 years following the trial and the reunion, Catherine established the Mercer Family Foundation, a non-profit organization with a specific and clearly defined mission, to support families affected by parental abduction, with a focus on the children who are taken and on the systems that fail to find them. It is not a large foundation in the way that some philanthropic organizations are large. It does not have a celebrity board or a splashy annual gala. It has a staff of 12, a network of partner organizations across 17 states, and a budget that Catherine funds personally and that she has consistently maintained at a level that allows the organization to do meaningful work without becoming an institution that exists to perpetuate itself rather than to serve the people it is supposed to serve. She has been very deliberate about that distinction. She has seen enough organizations, in her business life and elsewhere, become more invested in their own survival than in their stated purpose, and she was not going to build another one of those. The foundation works in 3 areas. The first is direct family support, connecting families of missing children with legal advocates, investigative resources, and psychological services that many families cannot afford on their own and that the public system does not reliably provide. Catherine knows from her own experience what it costs to navigate that system without resources, and she knows what those resources can mean in terms of outcomes, and she is not interested in that gap existing when she has the means to close it for some families. The second area is systemic advocacy, working with law enforcement agencies and forensic identification bodies to improve the protocols around child death determinations in cases where remains are incomplete or identification is uncertain. This is the direct result of what happened in Noah's case, where the pressure to close a case and provide a grieving parent with certainty resulted in a conclusion that was not certain at all. Catherine has testified before a state legislative committee on this issue. She plans to continue doing so. The third area is perhaps the most quietly important, a program that trains school counselors and pediatric healthcare workers to recognize the signs of a child living under a false identity, the behavioral patterns, the gaps in documentation, the specific ways that a child who knows the truth of their situation but cannot say it directly will sometimes try to communicate it to a trusted adult. Noah has spoken at 2 of the Foundation's training sessions. He was 16 at the first one. He stood in front of a room of 30 school counselors and he told them what he wished someone had noticed, what signs he had given that no one around him was equipped to read, what a child in his situation needs from an adult who suspects something is wrong. The room was completely silent the entire time he spoke. When he finished, there was a long pause before the applause. The facilitator said afterward that it was the most effective training session she had ever run, and that she had been running them for 11 years. Noah is 17 now. He is in his junior year of high school, a school he chose himself, in the district where he and Catherine live, a school he described when he visited it as feeling like a place where people were allowed to be complicated. Catherine took that as a good sign and enrolled him. He is on the debate team. He is not, he will tell you, a natural public speaker in the way his mother is. He does not have her particular combination of precision and composure under pressure, at least not yet, though people who watch him in debate rounds say he has something that might eventually be better than that, which is a quality of genuine conviction that is impossible to manufacture. He cares about what he argues. He argues for things because he believes them, not because he has been assigned them, and when he is on the other side of a position he does not believe, it costs him something that is visible in the way he carries himself. His coach says this is something he will have to learn to manage competitively. Noah says he is not sure he wants to. His mother, hearing this, said nothing. She just smiled. Because she recognized it. Because she was the same way. Because you cannot cover the electricity bill at 15 and build a $2 billion company from a second-hand desk if you are capable of committing fully to things you do not believe. He has her wiring. Completely. And she could not be more grateful for it. He has not spoken publicly about David Hale beyond the formal interviews required by the investigation and the trial. He has been asked, many times, whether he is angry. He has always given some version of the same answer, which is that anger takes up a great deal of space and he has other things he would rather use that space for. People sometimes take this as a sign of remarkable emotional maturity. Noah himself says it is less maturity and more pragmatism. He said once, in a conversation with a journalist that was on the record, "I was 6 when he took me and I am 17 now." He did not get to define the first 6 years and I am not going to let him define the next 11. The journalist asked what he meant by define. He said, take up the most space. Be the main thing. The journalist, who had been covering stories like this one for 20 years, said that she put her pen down after he said that and had to collect herself before she could continue the interview. She said she had never heard a 17-year-old speak about their own history with that kind of deliberate clarity. She said she thought he was going to be extraordinary. She said it without qualification, the way you say something when you are not performing an opinion but simply stating what you see. I believe her. I think he already is. There is one more thing about this story that I want to share with you before we close. It is something Catherine mentioned in passing in an interview, not a major interview, not a high-profile one, but a conversation with a writer working on a long-form piece about parental abduction for a regional magazine. The writer asked Catherine if she had ever written anything during the 7 years, journal entries, letters, anything. Catherine said that she had not kept a journal. She had tried once and found it made the grief worse, not better, to see it laid out in her own handwriting. But she had, on 3 separate occasions, written letters to Noah. Letters she never sent because there was nowhere to send them. Letters she wrote on the anniversaries of his birthday, not every year, just 3 times in 7 years, in the years when the weight of the day was particularly impossible to simply carry in silence and she needed somewhere to put it. She did not read them aloud in the interview. She summarized them. She said the first one, written on what would have been his 7th birthday, was mostly apology. She said she apologized for working so much. She apologized for the red-eye flights and the missed dinners and the evenings when he had been asleep by the time she got home and she had stood in his doorway looking at him in the dark, already asleep, and told herself she would make it up to him, she would make it up to him, she was always going to make it up to him. She apologized for all the ways she had been present in the building and absent in the home. She said writing it felt like screaming into something that would absorb the sound. She folded it and put it in the wooden box with the smooth stone and the dinosaur and the drawing. It is still there. The second letter, written on what would have been his 9th birthday, was different. She said it was less apology and more, she searched for the word and settled on accounting. She was trying to account for herself to him. To explain who she was and where she had come from and why she had made the choices she had made, not to excuse them but to make sure that if he was somehow somewhere able to hear her, he understood her. She told him about Linda, her mother, and the laundromat on 5th Street, and the electricity bill, and the notebook she carried everywhere, and the second-hand desk. She told him about the moment she knew she had made something real, not the valuation, not the magazine cover, but the moment one of her first 11 clients renewed their contract and said it was the best operational decision their company had made in 5 years. She said she wanted him to know that she had built something real. She wanted him to know it had been real. Even if it had cost them both too much. The third letter, written on what would have been his 11th birthday, was the shortest. She said it was 1 paragraph. She said it said, "I am still here. I am still looking. I have not stopped looking for a single day. If you can hear this, know that I am still here. And if you cannot hear this, if this is only going into the silence, then I want to say it anyway, because the alternative is not saying it, and not saying it is not something I am willing to do. I love you. I am your mother. I am still here." She put that letter in the wooden box with the others. She told the interviewer that she had not opened the box since finding Noah, that she had thought about opening it and reading the letters with him, but that it had not felt like the right time yet, and that she was following his lead on the timeline for everything, including that. The interviewer asked if she thought she ever would. Catherine said she thought so. She said Noah had asked her once what was in the box, he had noticed it on her desk years ago, before he knew what it was, and she had told him it was things she had kept for him. He had nodded and not asked further. She said she thought that when he was ready to know what was in it, he would ask. And she would be there to tell him. She is always going to be there to tell him. That is, ultimately, the promise at the center of this entire story. Not the reunion. Not the trial. Not the foundation or the mural or the climbing rose or the dark blue bedroom walls. The promise. I am still here. I am your mother. I am still here. It is the simplest thing a parent can say, and sometimes, under the weight of ambition and exhaustion and the 10,000 ways that life expands to fill the available space, it is the hardest thing to actually mean with your whole body and your whole attention. Catherine Mercer learned to mean it the hard way. She is still learning. She will tell you that herself. She does not present this story as a completed arc, as a wound fully healed, as a lesson perfectly absorbed. She presents it as an ongoing practice. The practice of showing up. The practice of being present. The practice of saying I am still here not just in the moments of crisis but in the ordinary Tuesday evenings that do not feel like they require it and that are, in fact, the entire point. What would it mean for you to say that to someone in your life tonight? Not in a grand gesture. Not in a speech. Just, in the small, sustained, daily way that matters most. I am still here. I see you. I am not going anywhere. Say it to whoever needs to hear it. Say it tonight. Before the feeling fades. Before the next thing comes along and takes the space that this story just opened up. Say it while you can. Thank you for staying until the very end of this story. From the opening image of that dusty hallway all the way to the finished mural and the climbing rose in the new garden, thank you for staying with every single part of it. It means more than you know, and it is not something we take for granted. If you are not yet subscribed to this channel, please take a moment right now to click the subscribe button and turn on your notifications, because the stories we bring you are not just entertainment. They are the kind of stories that sit with you. That come back to you 3 days later in the middle of an ordinary moment and remind you of something you needed to be reminded of. We work hard to bring you stories like that, and we do not want you to miss a single one. And if this story moved you, if Catherine and Noah's story made you feel something real, something you are still carrying right now as you hear these final words, leave a comment below and tell me about it. Tell me what moment got to you most. Was it the hook at the beginning, that image of standing in the hallway and hearing the floorboard creak in a dead child's bedroom? Was it the moment at the top of the stairs when she opened that door? Was it what Noah said, I didn't think you'd ever come back here? Was it Rosa, quietly keeping a child alive across 3 years of silence and fear because she had made a promise to him the day he was born? Tell me. Tell me what you would have done if you were standing in that doorway. Tell me if there is someone in your life who came into your mind while you were watching this, someone you have been meaning to show up for more completely. Tell me if you called them. I read every comment on this channel. Every single one. And I want to hear from you specifically, not just because the algorithm rewards engagement, but because this is the point of all of it. The conversation. The human connection that stories make possible between people who have never met and may never meet but who are, in this moment, in this shared experience of this story, experiencing something real together. That is not a small thing. That is actually the whole thing. The next story we are bringing you involves a woman who, after her husband was declared dead following a military accident overseas, received a phone call 3 years later from a number she did not recognize. And when she answered, she heard his voice. What came out of that phone call, and the investigation that followed, and the impossible choice she was ultimately asked to make, is one of the most extraordinary documented cases of a life rebuilt from nothing that we have ever covered on this channel. You will not see it coming. And you will not be able to stop thinking about it afterward. You are going to want to be here for it. Subscribe so you are. Thank you. Take care of the people close to you tonight. Go call whoever came into your mind while you were watching this story. Do not wait for a better moment. Do not wait until after the next thing. Right now, when the feeling is still with you, use it. They are waiting. They have been waiting. And they will not say so, because people who love you rarely do. But they are waiting. Go.